First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the neural for the language of thought. As you can see, this is joint work with David Barrack of the University of Pennsylvania. And the reason for this talk is that, if we wonder what kind of cognitive processes does the brain or nervous system do, there's still a ongoing dispute about whether at least some of the processes, the cognitive processes, and the representations involved in these processes are language-like. And this idea is known as the language of thought hypothesis. It's been around for a while, and it's had moments of dominance in the especially philosophical debate, but also classical cognitive science. In the 70s and 80s, it was very influential, and this work is partially builds on previous work that I've done. Here's a couple of references, and you will still find people to this day defending something like the Fodorian language of thought hypothesis with references to photopilation, some of the classic defenders of the language of thought. So, for example, Ned Block has a recent book entitled something like the border between seeing and thinking, in which he just takes it for granted that there's a language of thought and that thought involves this language of thought. And then the whole book is devoted to rebutting the arguments that language of thought is also involved in perception. So he argues that perception, generally speaking, does not require or involve a language of thought. It's not conceptual, it's not propositional, it's iconic instead of discursive. But he's sort of presupposing this argument wouldn't even need to be made if there was no language of thought in this classical sense of Jerry Fodor's and position. Okay, so I think that, and David, of course, when I say I speak to some degree on behalf of David. We think that that the debate hasn't been conducted at the appropriate level of depth and detail, and specifically the question of the hardware needed for supporting the language of thought has not really been properly addressed, and it hasn't been addressed in the context of what we know about the brain. Of course, there have been various arguments in this direction, but I think we can do better, in part by building on recent work on physical computation and the mechanisms of computation. So the starting point is that we need, to have a language of thought, we need appropriate software or representations, of course. That's where the debate has usually taken place, but also hardware. So what do we mean? By software, I mean changeable states, such as the strings of digits within a computer, like an artificial computer, or spike trains within a brain. By hardware, we mean computational architecture. That's another notion that's often misunderstood or conflated with implementation. For example, David Marr, has the three levels of analysis of a computational system: the computational, algorithmic, and the implementation. And when he mentions computational architecture, he basically says he means implementation. He uses those interchangeably. I think he mentions computational architecture only once or twice. But the point is that nowhere in this hierarchy of levels, Marrian levels, is there computational architecture proper as opposed to implementation, where the implementation is what we might call the technology. Okay, like, are we using integrated circuits or transistors or gears? That's the kind of technology used, including maybe the materials involved. Whereas what I call computational architecture is the kinds of computing components that are involved. Are there processors separate from memory? Do the processors execute instructions or are they hardwired to perform certain operations? That kind of description of the systems of the components of the system and their organization, they're already computational. It's a computational description, but it's a description of the components and their organization, the computing mechanisms, if you will. Okay. Okay, so we want to look at that, and we want to see if what are the requirements for different kinds of language of thought hypotheses, and are they satisfied by the brain? So another important distinction that's often not recognized is different kinds of language of thought hypothesis. And the first that we're interested in, we're going to ignore any purely syntactic language of thought theory, like the one from Stephen Stitch, 1983 or 5, from folk psychology to cognitive science, where he proposes a purely syntactic theory. We're not. I mean, that's kind of an interesting idea too, but and it's certainly a language of thought. But we're gonna set that aside. It didn't really take off. Even Stitch sort of changed his mind about that. So we're going to start with a basic representational language of thought, according to which some cognitive states, or maybe some cognitive events, that's an important difference that I'm not going to dwell a lot on, but it can be quite important for our purposes. But, in the interest of time. Anyway, some cognitive states, at least some, maybe some important ones, represent their targets in a language-like way. This is an old idea. It goes back even to maybe Aristotle. It was maybe most carefully articulated in earlier times by Occam. And then it kind of comes back in the second half of the 20th century. So why does it come back? Well, one reason is that in the second half of the 20th century, or after 1936-ish, we now have a theory of digital computation, a mathematical theory of computation that can specifies the precise limits of what can be computed and what cannot be computed, including the fact that digital computers can, or algorithms for digital computers can manipulate formal language-like systems in interesting ways that respect semantic properties of the representations. Maybe they can prove theorems within certain systems, certain kinds of theorems within certain systems, and so forth. Is the work of Kurt Gödel, Alonzo Church, Alan Turing, especially Turing machines. All of that. So that, and then the rise of digital computers. So. But also analog computers. Analog computers were also quite important at that time. So people started talking about computation being the kind of process for manipulating language-like representations in interesting ways that maybe respect the inferential relations between the language-like representations. So as far as I can tell, Wilfrid Sellars, 1960, is the first person to explicitly articulate something like a combination of a representational language of thought, which can already be found in Occam and other ancient authors and medieval authors, plus the idea that computation is involved. Okay, so that's what we call computational language of thought. And then we want to get all the way to the best known, the most discussed version of computational language of thought, which is what we call classical language of thought. And that's the combination of the computational language of thought with the idea that these representations and computations are digital, and typically there's even more than that. And so we want to distinguish three versions of the classical language of thought. A weak version, according to which there are these hardwired digital circuits. That idea can be found in McCullough and Pitts. They don't really talk about language-like representations, but they do talk about representations having propositional content. Anyway, theirs is not quite a full language of thought hypothesis, but they do have the idea that there are digital circuits in the brain. The brain is like a Turing machine. Maybe Harman has this idea. I don't know because I haven't double checked, but it's part of the project to double check Harman to see if it fits here. Then there is a moderate version of the classical language of thought, according to which the machinery for the language of thought is a bunch of hardwired classical modules. And then there is the full-blown strong classical language of thought, according to which the processors that manipulate these language-like representations are like the processors of a digital computer, and therefore they execute programs. They compute by executing programs. The programs are written there somewhere in the machine. So even the programs themselves are language-like. The control system for the computations involves language-like representations, not just the data. The data are language-like. The instructions are language-like as well. Okay, so now we're going to go through what are the requirements for these different theories and which ones are satisfied. So clearly, some further clarifications first. The scope of these kinds of theories can be wider or narrower depending on how many cognitive capacities are covered. Some of these views have been extended to other species. People like Randy Gottesdal say even ants need a language of thought to navigate. So language of thought is very widespread in the animal kingdom and needed for relatively basic forms of cognition, because even those are very sophisticated and require the kinds of representational computational capacities that come with the language of thought. The classical, by the way, classical language of thought, not any language of thought. Now, it could be about either cognitive states that are kind of tokened or activated at a same time, like, writing a sentence in a computer, and then that's, or an instruction, and then that instruction is activated and executed at once. But it could also involve events that unfold over time. So an event, like a series of neural activations, could have a language-like structure, like the spoken sentence. A spoken sentence occurs over time. We can get more detailed about the specific analogies involved that make this hypothesis a language of thought hypothesis. It could be an analogy either with natural language or artificial language. So different authors have used analogies. Sellers and Harman were using analogies with natural language. Famously, Fodor and Piccinini use an analogy with artificial languages and computer languages. One minor but important clarification for some people is that even for people like Sellers or Harman, who argue that the language of thought is natural language, they don't have to require or assume that you cannot think at all before you acquire a language. All they have to assume is that in order to think, or think in the right sorts of ways, or to have the right kind of cognitive processes, you have to have the right kind of machinery that allows you to acquire a natural language. Okay, so that will not come back, but I say it because some people asked that kind of question in the past. Now, what are the most basic analogies? It seems to me that the most basic are subject-predicate structure. So the representations involved in at least some forms of thought must have this subject-predicate structure, which is kind of both syntactic and semantic, and the ability to combine elements, subjects and predicates to form sentences or sentence-like representations, and then the ability to combine these sentence-like representations into larger, more complex sentences, using something like logical connectives. And then there's a bunch of other analogies that can be used, the idea that the constituents of the representations are quote-unquote discrete, in some relevant sense, that instructions are digital instructions like those of a computer, that there's a compositional semantics, or at least partially compositional semantics, and inference, looks like inferences in the language, or maybe logical inference. Okay. So those are some clarifications. So starting with representational language of thought, I would say this one does not really have a lot of specific hardware requirements because it's very elliptical or vague about what the machinery is that's involved. But we can say that it's very plausible, at least with respect to introspectable discursive thought. A lot of people report experiencing at least some thoughts as having a kind of linguistic or language-like structure, and they can report their content in linguistic form, of course. Not everybody does. Some people report that their thoughts don't have kind of a sentence-like structure, but at least for some people, the fact that they experience it this way is good evidence that there's something language-like going on, at least in some people's minds, but also normal functioning humans do process language. So the fact that we process language suggests that there's going to be some kind of neural process corresponding to the processing of language, and so there's going to be some kind of internal neural structure that mirrors the structure of the language that we either understand and process when we hear it, or read it, or when we utter sentences or write down sentences or type sentences. And in fact, there's a large neuroscience literature on this, in which people identify neural signatures of their linguistic structures when subjects are engaged in linguistic cognition. Okay, so I don't take this to be controversial, this representational language of thought. But of course, it's a far cry from the classical language of thought hypothesis. Now, with respect to computational language of thought, that's basically an aspect of it's the combination of a computational theory of cognition and a representational language of thought. And this could be, I try to make it clear, it could be relatively restricted in scope. It could apply only to some forms of linguistic cognition in humans, and not to other aspects of cognition, let's say perception in humans or other species. Although there might be some other aspects of human cognition besides linguistic cognition itself, that involves something similar. And Stanislav Dehaene and colleagues have argued that math and music are also domains where there's something similar to a language-like system of representations that are processed computationally that's going on. Okay, so we could talk about why people think that computation is involving cognition, but that's not really specific to language. But once you add language-like representations, they could be language-like neural representations. Neural representations that carry some kind of signature of language-like structure, then you end up with this computational language of thought. Okay, but again, this is a far cry from the classical language of thought, which says something much more specific, namely that the language of thought works like the representations and computations in a digital computer. So let's start with the weak and then work our way to the strong classical language of thought. So as I mentioned, Turing formalized the notion of digital computation, with others as well. Then McCullough and Pitts argue that brains are basically "quote unquote" Turing machines, meaning logic neurons are like logic gates, and circuits of simple feed-forward circuits are like of neurons are like Boolean circuits. And then you can put them together, you can add recurrence, you can get them to be like finite state automata, but basically, and then if you add a tape, then you can get them to do anything that a Turing machine can do. we can add something that wasn't explicit in McCulloch and Pitts, and that is that these digital vehicles, these like signals that neurons are supposed to send to each other, and they're supposed to be digital, like those of a digital computer, have language-like features. Now, look, what about the hardware requirement? What are these digital processing units, and how are they put together to process language-like vehicles? That's the big question that we should answer. Okay, so we're going to get to that, and preview. The answer is going to be there's no such thing. Okay, even McCulloch and Pitts realized pretty quickly that the brain doesn't work like that, and I don't think any computational neuroscience or any neuroscientist would disagree with that. And we'll also try to see very quickly reasons why people have not be bothered by this or not worried about it. But I'll argue that we should worry about this. Okay, now the moderate version of the classical adds that there are these special purpose modules for specific capacities. So it's not just that there are these circuits in the brain, but they form these specialized modules. Maybe they're domain specific, and then they have other various characteristics. Of course, there's a whole debate in literature on whether to the degree to which the brain is modular, and the degree and the various features that these modules may or may not have. And we don't need to get into that. It's just that for this to work in the intended way, there needs to be at least the capacity to store the language-like representations long enough for the processors, these hardwired digital processors, to go through their hardwired computation. So you need to define the digital processors, and you need to define the digital memory storage units or registers. Okay. Now notice that there's going to be a lot of rigidity in a system like that, because if you want to change anything about how the computations are performed, you need to kind of rewire the circuits, which was done in early digital computers, but quickly people figured it would be much more flexible if we could just use programs and switch programs instead of rewire the processor to do a different computation. So there comes the strong classical language of thought hypothesis, which says that these processors, whether there's many or one, whether it's just a periphery of cognition or also central cognition, those are additional questions. Famously, Fodor denies that central cognition can be computational because computation is local, but central cognition is global. Anyway, we're not going to get into that, but other people have disagreed and said, no, it's all language of law. It's all language of thought, like computational all the way. But what matters for us is that in this case, there is a very flexible and powerful control mechanism for switching between different computations, and that is program execution. That's how our digital computers work nowadays, all of them, and virtually all of them. At least the things that really deserve the term computer, like the laptop that I'm using now to communicate with you, they execute programs, and that's how they determine which computations are performed at any given time. Obviously, these programs have to be stored somewhere in addition to the data. So the data need to be stored in appropriate memory registers that have the right kind of stability and so forth. Then the programs also need to be stored, and then there needs to be components that keep track of which instruction needs to be executed at any given time, and they fetch the right instruction from the right register at the right time, and then they store the data, the results of the computation, until the next instruction gets fetched and executed. So there's all these mechanisms for keeping track of partial data, during a process, instructions, have to be brought in, executed, and then another one needs to be brought in and executed, and so forth. Okay, so you need to keep track of where you are in the process. So there's mechanisms for doing all of this. So all of this has to be found. If the brain works like that, all of this has to be found in the brain. Okay, so before we get to the punchline, I want to address a couple of reasons or arguments that have been given in the past to try to block this, what I'm going to get to, meaning the conclusion that there's no such thing because there's no such mechanisms in the brain. So one is these architectural arguments. I call architectural arguments that there are these general computational considerations that favor a classical language of thought hypothesis as opposed to something else, connectionism or computational neuroscience. Somehow these are supposed to rule out anything that's not a classical language of thought. And the best known is probably the productivity and systematicity arguments from photoabolition, but there's also argument from memory storage that Randy Gallistos has promoted in recent years, and there's others. So just very quickly, I'm going to point out that brains are finite, so they're going to be computationally equivalent to a very, very, very large finite state automaton. Now, I'm the first person to say architecture matters. Computational architecture matters. I'm not saying, oh, it doesn't matter what the architecture is because it's just a finite state automaton. No, I'm just using finite state automata to delimit the class of computations involved, and then point out that there are many ways of building devices that are computationally equivalent to a finite state automaton. And notice, I'm not saying there are many ways of building finite state automata. Of course, there are many ways of building finite state automata, but there are even more ways of building devices that are computationally equivalent to finite state automata. They don't have to be finite state automata in a literal sense of having the kind of digital structure of a finite state automaton, but they have to have the computational capacity of a finite state automaton. And so some are going to be digital and classical, like those posited by the classical language of thought hypothesis, but some are non-classical, some are non-digital, some are already known, and many are not even known yet. We've heard yesterday, various talks on neuromorphic computation and on conventional models of computation. A lot of those are going to be, typically those are going to be equivalent to finite state automata. At best, they could be, idealizing, they could be equivalent to Turing machines. We don't need to idealize here, or we can. It doesn't really matter. Even if we want to use Turing machines as our limit, we can still talk about what the brain is actually capable of, and there's going to be many ways that it could be doing it. Okay, so the bottom line is to find out what brains do. We need to study brains to figure out how the brains do it. The cognition, we have to figure out what the actual machinery is. And so it turns out that neural representations and computations, including the hardware, don't look at all like what's needed for the classical language of thought of any sort. Now, there's another quote-unquote objection, and that's what I'm calling the implementation objection. That's also to be found in photoabolition. And they say connectionism. I'm not attached to the word connectionism at all, by the way, but they use the word connectionism. And presumably they would extend that to any kind of mainstream neurocomputational approach. Anyway, they talk about connectionist theories. They're merely about implementation. Therefore, we don't have to worry about that. We're talking about actual cognitive processes, the computations that are involved in cognition. That's what we're theorizing about. What the physical mechanisms for implementing that are doesn't matter to us. That's not our concern. So yeah, maybe connectionists are trying to figure out how the brain does these computations, but we are telling you that these computations have to be language-like in the classical sense, meaning like the way a digital computer works. then you guys can figure out how the brain does it. But if you're telling me that the brain does something different, you're on the wrong track, because your job is to find out how the brain does these classical language like computations. And the main problem with this quote unquote objection is that it conflates the implementation with architecture. So again, it when they say implementation, they're ambiguous between the technology used. Are we using biological neurons? Are we using artificial neurons? And computational architecture, which is what I'm talking about. Meaning, are we using some kind of digital processors? Are we using some kind of stable digital memory? Are we using programs? Therefore, are we using a program counter to keep track of where we are in the program, and so forth? How are these things connected to each other, such that they can fetch instructions fast enough for the processing cycle to go through, but not too fast, so that they would block it. And so those are the kinds of questions that I am raising here. And if we look at neurocomputation architecture, and it doesn't support the classical language of thought, then the classical language of thought fails. And the only way to study neurocomputation architecture is to study actual nervous systems. Okay, so to recap, the hardware requirements for the classical language of thought are not only a digital code that would support this language like data and possibly instructions, but also digital processors that are either hardwired or more likely to be really flexible. They would have to respond appropriately to instructions. Then there would have to be digital memory registers separate from the processors for the data and possibly the instructions. And then a bunch of other devices to coordinate the interaction between the processor and the memory. Control units to fetch the instructions or the data from memory and select the operations, and program counters to keep track of which instructions are to be executed at any given time, on which data, and where to find the relevant data and instructions in the registers. But even if it's a bunch of hardwired modules, which would be a lot less flexible, you still need to store the data separate from the processors, and you still need to be able to send the data back and forth as you process them, and you store the right kinds of intermediate results and so forth. So there still need to be the right kind of coordination between memory and processors. Okay, and needless to say, there's none of this is found in the brain. None of it. Not the digital code, not the digital processors, not the digital memory storage, not the mechanisms for coordinating between the two. None of it. So even the code is not there, because the neural code is not a digital code, or digital in the right kind of way. And now I've argued about this kind of separately in previous work, which eventually got version of which is also republished in my 2020 book. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but the main idea is that neurons send spike trains to each other. Sometimes they're bursts, sometimes there's a firing rate, sometimes they're individual spikes, and the timing even matters for certain purposes. But none of that can be kind of precisely organized into well-defined time interval, such that if there is a signal during that time interval, it counts as a type of signal, and if there's not, it counts as another type of signal. And there's no other way of kind of classifying types of neural signals into finally many digital types. Okay. Yes, I mean, this is it's a long argument that I have given somewhere else, but I'm just kind of gesturing at it here. Now, that's not to deny that sometimes, in some cases, for example, when we process language, some signals from some neural populations a mirror, acquire a kind of language-like structure. So it's not that neural representations are incompatible with processing language. Of course, they're compatible. We do speak. But that in the general case, they don't have a digital code from which you can build a language-like representational system in the way that you do with the digital computer. That's what the classical language of thought hypothesis posits, okay? To round this up, Gallus' hypothesis, so Gallus has argued in recent years that this digital memory that is needed for the classical language of thought is actually stored in intracellular RNA. It's not a bunch of neuronal signals. It's a bunch of molecules inside the cells. Now, there's plenty of evidence that intracellular processes are relevant for memory, of course, because ultimately to stabilize, say, for example, synaptic changes, you're going to need to have some kind of gene expression that changes the strength of the synapse in some way or another. But that's not at all what Gallus requires. Gallus, kind of a molecular language of thought hypothesis, requires that there is a way to keep track of the molecular structures that encode specific memories and fetch them when needed and process them in the right order in accordance with the right algorithm, presumably all inside the cells. And then all of this has to be transduced back and forth with the spike trains that neurons use to communicate with each other. So this, would have to be found. This information would have to be found in the spike trains, but also then it would have to be encoded in these molecules and then processed inside the cell. So this is at best, very speculative hypothesis for which there is virtually no evidence and also no proposals for how it would all work. So I don't think this is a especially plausible, even serious hypothesis. Okay, so in conclusion, the classical language of thought theorists often provide some kind of behavioral evidence, but that there's a language of thought or language of thought process are involved in something. But at best, this supports the representational and maybe the generic computational language of thought. It does not support the classical version of the language of thought, which is the one that everybody's familiar with, or that most people are familiar with. And the reason is that the classical language of thought hypothesis has specific representational and hardware requirements. It requires a certain type of digital code from which you build these language-like structures in the way that you build them in a digital computer, and you process them in the way that a digital computer processes its digital code. But that is not compatible with most of what we know about neural representations and computations. So classical language of thought is not a plausible hypothesis about how the brain works or how cognition works, even though it's very plausible that at least some neural representations and computations do have language-like structure, but those are very kind of specialized types of processes that are needed for, say, processing language, and maybe something broadly speaking, linguistic cognition, maybe also math and music, as far as we can tell. So it's more restricted in scope. It's compatible with mainstream computational neuroscience. It does not involve the kinds of digital representations and mechanisms that were posited by the classical language of thought theorists. Thank you.